So thanks for coming to the first City Forum of the semester. We've got 5 solid events lined up for the spring. Our next event will feature our own Tara Dudley. That's going to be on February 16th, so mark your calendars for that. And I think, where's Abigail? Did the whole schedule go out to folks as well? Okay, so you have all the dates. So I want to thank Abigail, Abigail Jackson, my RA, for making everything happen, organizing all the speakers, doing logistics, getting lunch. So thanks, Abigail. So a couple things at the top I just want to announce. So first, happy Black History Month. It's a great moment to reflect upon how you can support Black artists, creators, academics, and business owners, as well as friends and family in your life. There's some events going on around the city this month. One at UT that y'all might want to check out is happening on Saturday, February 10th. It's called Afrofuturism and the Law. Seems like it's a day-long seminar, so you can Google that. And then second, as is typical for City Forum, I want to offer a land acknowledgement that resists Indigenous erasure and supports Indigenous people in their ongoing struggles. So over time, Indigenous people residing in Central Texas have faced disease, war, genocide, and forced relocation. Yet they continue to exist and live here in their homelands. Tribes residing in Central Texas include the Alabama Coshada, the Caddo, the Carrizo Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, among others. And at UT, there's an ongoing struggle aimed at returning the remains of 3 indigenous ancestors that are currently housed at the Texas Archaeological Research Lab on the Pickle campus. If you go online and search for UT Return the Remains and head over to the Indigenous Cultures Institute link that pops up, you can sign an open letter to President Hartzell asking him to end the delay in the return and to take immediate action to return the ancestors to the Miacan Garza Band of Coahuiltecans. Today, our speaker, we're really lucky to have Rich Heyman as our City Forum presenter. Rich has taught at UT since 2006 in the Urban Studies, Geography, American Studies, and right here in the Community Regional Planning program. His research has appeared in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Geoforum, Antipode, Cartographia, American Quarterly, and Environment and Planning D, among other places. He received his PhD in Geography from the University of Washington in 2004, and today he'll present his seminar on the cost of dispossession. So thanks, Rich, for...
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Abigail as well for helping organize me and get me here and everything. Yeah, so today I'm talking about dispossession. We just heard about indigenous dispossession. Today I'm going to be talking about dispossession of Black people in Austin and a project that we have been working on, a team that is made up of folks who work at UT and who work at the City of Austin in the Equity Office, looking at the history of displacement and dispossession of Black property owners and Black property in Austin. And this is a list of folks who are who have been and are currently. It's been a project ongoing for a couple of years, so some of these folks have moved on. Some of them, you might recognize a couple names of some people who are grad students in CRP. So this is the research team, so I want to acknowledge all of them, and I'm presenting the study that we did. So the story. I wanted to start with the summer of 2020 in the Black Lives Matter movement protest that took place here in Austin. As hopefully you all remember, it was, there was a lot of activity around the issues of policing, and that brought to light all kinds of other anti-Black policies in the city, going all the way back to slavery, and a kind of reckoning with the history of anti-Black racism in Austin. And as a result, in March of 2021, the City Council passed this resolution. These are just some excerpts from it, but it was resolution whatever number, 67 from that year. And a couple of the things that it calls out when acknowledging the different kinds of anti-Black racism that took place are ones that are specifically related to planning, to geography. So these 1 and 2 correspond to the 2 components of the work of the research that I'm going to talk about today. So one was calling out the 1928 master plan, which you probably already know, and I'm going to mention it a little bit more. So it calls out the segregation plan. And it also calls out other kinds of acts of dispossession, including gentrification and redlining. So being a geographer, when I came onto the team, these were two of the components that I focused on working on those aspects. And the city council, the resolution was, lists all kinds of different things that have taken place, acknowledging different freedom colonies that have been located in central Texas. But the resolution, essentially this paragraph here, the city apologizes for a history of anti-black racism and then resolves to do something about it. Now, they don't use the term reparations, they don't use the term reparative or any of the variations on that, but they talk about two things. One is that they charge the city manager with doing some kind of study that focuses on the economic value, that's how they framed it, of all these kinds of anti-black racist policies. Direct, indirect, intentional, and unintentional harm caused through economic, health, environmental, criminal justice, and other racial disparities, and declination of resources of the city to be developed. Those are all the things. And then the study is to be developed through a partnership between UT Austin and Houston Tillotson. And that specific partnership broke down a little bit. And the city manager assigned the particular task of doing this study to the equity office at the city, and the equity office got in touch with Ted Gordon, who works in the provost office on the commemoration initiative on campus that has been working on kind of racial reckoning on campus. And Ted formed the research group to help the city do some components of the study that we could do. Now you can see it's a very, a capacious charge that they're giving the city manager. So the team that I worked on just took on a couple components of it, and those are the ones I'm going to talk about today, specifically the 1928 master plan and issue of redlining, which I'll get into. I want to note this last box that's on here, which was that the city was really being pushed not just by the people in the streets in BLM, but also through organized community-based organizations and a coalition called the Black Austin Coalition, BAC, that came together and proposed an idea of what they called a black embassy. And so the city also further resolved to create a centralized black research and cultural center, a black embassy, that is geared to the success and cultural promotion of the demographics in need by providing relevant resources and support for existing and future black-led businesses and organizations in a central location in East Austin. So thus far, the city hasn't moved forward on this particular aspect of it. So the idea, I think, was that the study and quantifying some of the anti-black racism that has taken place historically was supposed to, in theory, create the framework through which a black embassy could be funded and created in East Austin. Now, I mean, since 2021, we've had a change of personnel on the council, including the mayor's office. We have a new city manager and a different political climate than there was at the time period during the pandemic and during the people uprising and really trying to grapple with some of these issues. Some of the political pressure has faded in the last couple of years, so the city council hasn't moved forward on the black embassy. So partly I've been trying to keep the idea alive by making sure people are aware of it and the connection between what we did with this study, trying to quantify the impact, the economic impact, as they say, of the 1928 plan and of redlining. Those are two specific parts that I'm going to talk about. How that is really connected to this idea of moving forward with some kind of resource center in East Austin. So we don't want to forget about that. So that's the context, right? So it's not an academic say, it has a pretty narrow focus. Quantifying the impacts specifically of the 1928 plan and the redlining that took place in Austin. What impact did that have on the black community? So that was what we were charged with. So the first part was thinking about the 1928 plan. That's where we focused first. And we began, well, here's the 1928 plan, just for those of you who aren't familiar with it. How many people aren't familiar with the 1928 plan? Okay, so I don't have to explain it, because in some of the versions of the talk I've explained it. So, but basically what happened was the result of the city council policies was to draw all the black people in Austin into East Austin through the selective hooking people up to public services like utilities, and also closing down black schools that were open around the city and only opening black schools on the east side, and having all the other segregated resources for black people on the east side, parks and recreation centers and all that kind of stuff. Black people were living all around Austin before this plan, and we began with a study that had been mostly headed up by, she's now a former undergraduate, but an undergraduate student at the time, Amy Shreve, who was mapping the US Census data for the city of Austin, the racial components of that data. And this is one of the maps that she made. And she made a whole series of maps of all the different available data. I think she's still working on 1950, which just became available last year after the 72-year blackout period. So she's just finishing up 1950, and I think she's gone all the way back at least to 1900 and maybe even to 1880. I can't remember exactly. But she's mapping all the different decennial censuses, the individual races of of people in Austin. But what we were interested in were the homeowners. And this is in 1920, so before the 1928 plan. And you can see that black people were living all over the city. There was a large black population in East Austin, of course, and here's East Avenue here on this this is one of the census maps that shows how they chopped up the city into the different enumeration districts and sent out the enumerators. That's what these numbers here are written on here, how they sent people out to take the census. That's why she mapped it on there. But there's a couple of important black settlements here. Of course, the one in that's now called West Campus was Wheatville, which was one of the early black settlements that at the time that it was settled was outside of the city limits. Same thing for Clarksville, which is right in this cluster. There was a cluster in South Austin near the city limits at the time. And it's a little bit hard to see in here, but there was a cluster along Red River Street, along essentially in the Waller Creek floodplain in the kind of eastern part of downtown below 15th Street, in that part along there, now where Waterloo Park is. And also around campus here, there was a few black homeowners in the area just around campus, but especially in this little cluster area, which is now where Dean Keaton and Red River, between Red River and the freeway, and just north of Dean Keaton, so where Astor's Ethiopian restaurant is, but there's several different apartment buildings right in that area there. That used to be a black neighborhood, exclusively black neighborhood that was there. That one's not a historic freedom colony. That one dates from around the turn of the 20th century. but it was cleared out when Red River was rerouted and the freeway was put in because some of the land was taken there, especially for the ramps that connected to Dean Keaton. Red River was rerouted so that they could put in Dean Keaton and have that extension going out to Manor Road. Okay, so that's where we started. By 1930, the movement of black people out of the parts of Austin that weren't East Austin had already begun. And so by 1930, between 20 and 30, the black population outside of East Austin declined by 6.4%. And the map, or the city plan had only been put in place, voted on in 1928. And the plan, the way that it worked was by denying those services to black people outside of East Austin. So it was a kind of choking off of those communities outside of East Austin. It wasn't an immediate eviction of people from those places. So it was something that took place over time. There isn't a single moment when black people left those historic communities, but it began right after the plan. So even by 1930, you can see East Austin black population grew by 62%, but and the city itself was growing rapidly at that time, but black people were declining in the rest of the city. So it began that movement of black people away from those places around East Austin where they were owning houses. So what we wanted to do was we thought one way to begin to quantify this thing, I mean, the idea of quantifying anti-black racism itself is, we have to admit, a little bit nutty. I mean, a little bit mind-blowing, like what does that mean? So what we tried to do is kind of take narrow pieces, say, okay, what we can do is we can say, here are these black homeowners who were, and these communities that were choked off by the 1928 plan. What kind of value did people lose by being forced to leave those parts of the city and move to East Austin or leave Austin altogether? Many people did move to East Austin. We think, although we haven't been able to, once we get the 1950 census map, we'll be able to start tracing things a little bit more to try to trace the movement of individual people or families across the city. But we think that it was more generational. So as people, like these clusters of homeowners seem to get older as the decennial years went by, indicating that all of the new families and households that were being set up in East Austin. There were no new households being set up of black households outside of East Austin. Instead, there was a kind of attrition as people died. They were no longer passing on their property to their descendants to live there. Okay, so that's part of the story. So we wanted to figure out what was the value of all this land outside of East Austin that black people had to give up because of this plan. So we took a narrow picture, and we narrowed it down even more. What was the value of the land itself? Because we didn't think we could compare the buildings, figure out the cost of the value of the building. So we began with the census, like I said, and here's just an example of what the census looks like at the individual household level, or the individual level, instead of just the aggregate. So this is, and you can see we had to decipher lots of handwriting, and you can get a certain amount of it, you get character recognition, but still there's a lot of cleaning up that has to be done, and a lot of that was done by Amy Shreve, headed up by her. So here, for example, is this particular family, the Watson family, and the head of this says head here, the head of the family was Solon, and he was a 50-year-old black male, and his wife was Mary. It's a little bit hard to see, but her name was Mary. She was 45 years old. They're married, and then there's a bunch of children. These are stepsons and stepdaughters, so these we're guessing are the children from a previous relationship that Mary had, but she was married to Solon. And there you can see here they were living on Leon Street, and here is the number of their house. So 2544 Leon Street, which is just here in West Campus area. and Solon's wife is listed as Mary. So then what we did was we went to the tax register for the city of Austin for 1920, and it's called the City Lot Register, which is at the History Center, the Austin History Center, part of the public library system down on, Guadalupe and 10th, 9th Street, right there. And we found that their entry is for Mary Watson. So she owned the house, even though Solon was listed as the head of the household, which is kind of interesting gender politics going on there, with whoever was doing the enumeration assumed that the man was the head of household, even though she is legally the owner of the house. And what this shows is this is the number of the lot that she was on, lot 23. It was in block 5 of outlot 55, which I'll explain in a minute. And this says what description of the lot. It was 50 feet by 200 feet. Sometimes there's no description, which means it's just the whole lot as it was laid out. And then here are the assessed amounts for the value of the land as $125, and the value of the improvements, the house, the buildings, was $50 at the time period. So what we did was we took this this is what we were interested in, the land. How much is that land worth today was our essential question. So what we could do was we could find her lot on the Travis County plat map. So here's lot 23. This is block 5, this chunk here. Outlot 55, which includes this area here. You can see this is 25th Street, and this is Waller Creek. And this is this was right when they were building what is today Lamar Boulevard. At first it was called Shoal Creek Boulevard. So when they were they were sketching in the road on top of the plat map right there. So this is really the heart of Wheatville, the Wheatville settlement. And at the time, the streets had slightly different names. This was called Grandview, but now it's Leon Street when it was laid out. And what we did was we mapped all the property owners all the black property owners outside of East Austin in terms of the land that they own. So each one of these blocks corresponds to a piece of black-owned land. This is the Wheatville portion of it, and you can see this is Mary's property right here, and it was 50 by 200 feet. It didn't quite cover the entire lot. We don't know why it doesn't have that little end here. And these two lighter orange circles we put here because there was two people who owned land and it was just described as along the creek. So we don't know. It was a 1/4 acre each along the creek somewhere, and it wasn't specified, and it's not on any of the historic maps. So we created maps for all the different parts of outside of East Austin for black homeowners, and those maps are on that web page that I showed, ctxretold.org, where you can find all the different maps, and you can click on the different years of the census and see how that all changed. Here is the Clarksville version of the map down, historic kind of West Austin, just south of what used to be here's Pease Park. This was all owned by the former governor of Texas, Elijah Pease, and a portion of it was sold to black people at the beginning, after the Civil War, of course. And they placed the state Confederate home where old Confederate soldiers who were, aging would live right next to this black community that had existed there before that came. So that was an interesting choice by them. Here's the part around campus. You can see this is what they called Texas State University at the time, UT. And this is essentially where Dean Keaton is now, right here. This is Waller Creek. There's two branches of Waller Creek that come together right here. So this little piece of land here is basically where Creekside Dorm and San Jacinto parking garage is, and kind of goes up the hill towards the law school. And this, which was called Wesleyan College, was purchased by UT in the 30s, I believe, and that's where they expanded and put the law school. So you can see that there was some black land ownership in here, And this is this cluster of black homeowners near where the freeway came to be. And this was called the Fellman Heights Edition. It was, that's just the name of the subdivision, because the guy who developed it was called Fellman, and for whatever reason, he decided he was only going to sell to black people. So all of the lots, he sold them only to black people. Just an interesting note about this piece of land here, that piece of land, we think, was the original site of what was called Wheeler's Grove, which was the place where black people celebrated Juneteenth until they moved to East Austin to Emancipation Park, which became the location of the Rosewood Courts public housing facility, which is now being privatized and redeveloped, along where Rosewood and Chacon meet over there. But this was the original, what we think was Wheeler's Grove. Wheeler was a former mayor of Austin. He later became lieutenant governor of Texas, and he owned a chunk of land over here that also included some of what became the Wesleyan College property. And it appears that he bought the land because of the wood, the trees on the land that he was selling as lumber, and had some deals with some wood companies, some lumber companies, but he went bankrupt and lost the land in a bankruptcy sale. But it was purchased by a whole series of black people later on. So we think that there was some attempt by black people to keep it in the black community, but we can't figure out what was built on it. From the records are not clear. But we have established a chain of land ownership that connects to the Givens family, which is, if you're familiar with East Austin, one of the large parks on East Austin is Givens Park, which was named after a very well-known dentist, Dr. Givens. And at one point, he owned this piece of land that he got from his parents, and I believe he was the last black homeowner, or the last black owner of that piece of land. Okay, so this was 1920. Okay, so then what we did was, once we found Mary Watson's property, and we knew what size it was, then we look on the TCAD website, the Travis Central Appraisal District website, where you can find out who owns what and what it's appraised at. So here's what's sitting on where her property used to be. You can see near the corner of Leon and 26th Street. It's a much bigger piece of land now that is occupied, or much bigger building that is on there. It's one of the apartment buildings over there nowadays. And if we go to the database part, we can see that the legal description of the current lot is made up of many of the original lots from that time period, including lot 23, which is what Mary owned at the time period. We can see what size the land is today. It's a tiny bit over an acre. And here's what the land was valued. This is from 2022, because we did this work last year. So it's already, there's already a 2023 price in here. So we know that her lot was 10,000 square feet, which is about a little less than a quarter of an acre. So we can make a percentage out of it and figure out what percentage of this value of the land today we can ascribe to Mary's lot at the time, and it's about $1.4 million that she kind of had to give up because of the 1928 plan. So this is our essential method that we used, and what we did was we look all over the city. We kind of grouped everything into 5 neighborhoods, even though some homeowners fell a little bit outside of each of those, but just for easy to keep track of. We mapped all of those, found all of the acres, and the value of all of that land that was lost by black homeowners came out to about $290 million. It's about 60 acres. There was about 180 land property owners at that time. Just a little bit of a side note, if you know anything about the history of black people in Austin, you may be aware that Clarksville, there were many, the folks who lived in Clarksville really fought against being evicted, being forced to move out, and they persisted in, black people persisted in living in Clarksville in significant numbers until the 1980s. It was at that time that the Clarksville Community Development Corporation was established to hold in trust some properties to be made available to the black community. And so there's still some black people living in Clarksville on property that's owned. There's a couple of properties that are still owned by families, but there's about a dozen properties that are owned by the Clarksville Community Development Corporation. And we did not include any of those properties in this assessment because those are still, we considered still in the black community and has not been lost. Just to clarify that. So that was the first portion of the study focusing on the 1928 plan. After we completed this, we went back to the city council resolution and we said, let's try to figure out how we can think about quantifying the value of redlining. And that was the second part. And we can kind of think of redlining as the time period 1935, which was when the Homeowners Loan Corporation created the famous redlining maps. I'll show you the one of Austin here in a second. And our end date for this was 1990, which I'll explain in a couple of minutes. So here's the HOLC map of Austin that was from 1935. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with these maps, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was set up in order to go around the country during the Depression and to help guide government, federal government programs that were aimed at assisting homeowners to stay in their homes during the economic crisis of the 1930s. And what they allegedly, ostensibly were trying to do was to figure out where in different cities were kind of good places for the government to back loans and help people stay in their homes, and where were financially risky places. That was the way that they framed it. And so this color coding was the green, or this teal color, I don't know what color that is, was considered quote unquote the best. Blue was the second best, called still desirable. Yellow was definitely declining, is what they called it. And red was hazardous. So, and what they mean by hazardous is hazardous from a financial perspective. And this corresponds very, very closely to where black people were living in Austin. We looked at how there was a cluster of black people living, especially in this part of South Austin and a little bit along some of the creeks. This is the Clarksville area in here. Here's Wheatville. This is the strip along Red River Street and Waller Creek floodplain. And there was a tiny little settlement of black residents up here along the upper parts of Shoal Creek, near where some of the hospital facilities are today, along, what is that, 35th Street, where it crosses Shoal Creek, up around in that area. And of course, this is East Austin. So we had kind of already dealt with these communities outside of East Austin, so we wanted to focus on what was the financial impact of redlining of East Austin. And what they did was they ran the red line up East Avenue, where the freeway came in, and then this is Manor Road today, right, just east of campus here. And so our thinking was, well, this is a very interesting juxtaposition here. On one side, you have a community that is largely African American, and it's redlined. That's the historic East Austin, which was designated as the Negro District in 1928. And just north of it, you have another neighborhood that is not redlined, and many of the subdivisions in that neighborhood actually have racially restricted covenants in them. So it's a kind of white protected neighborhood, largely, not every one of those. And so we thought this was a very interesting place where we could see what the effects are between these two neighborhoods by comparing them the values of the property over time. So, oh yeah, here's the report from the HOLC, because they not only created maps, but wrote written reports. Some of the reports that they did on different cities are very extensive and talk in depth about each neighborhood. In Austin, it's a relatively short document, but they talk a little bit about the black neighborhoods in Austin. It says it will be observed there are small Negro residential sections in the best parts of the city. Those are those ones that were existing kind of where Wheatville was, Clarksville, and the one up on Upper Shoal Creek. Real estate men explained that the Negroes had occupied these sections for many decades, and because of the superiority of the residential section surrounding them, meaning mostly protected by racially restricted deed covenants, there has been no blighting of the areas surrounding the colored section. So that's why these areas here are very clearly delineated. Like Wheatville is surrounded by the teal color, the best property, right? The best indication. So the other thing about these maps, about what the HOLC did, was the way that they worked, for those of you who don't know too much about redlining, was they went and interviewed people in the city who were in the real estate and mortgage industry. So people who financed home ownership, who were dealing with real estate. Some of the builders, there was a lot of builders who financed the construction of the houses, and actually instead of getting a separate mortgage from a company, it would just be the lumber company would lend you the money and things like that. So they interviewed those folks, and they say this map represents the composite judgment of some 7 reliable and well-informed real estate and mortgage men of Austin. 7 old people, right? Anyway, in other cities, it was more extensive. They talked to more people and things like that. But the point is that the map, even though they've gotten a lot of press recently about the effect of these maps, the thing is that they are really, what they're doing is documenting what was already taking place in Austin even before any of the New Deal programs were in place, right? So even though these maps, the reports were intended to steer federal government programs, and they did that to a certain extent, different in different cities, they really capture what was already the practices of the real estate industry on the ground in Austin. So what this tells us is already in 1935, these areas were being denied investment in those areas, right? So the real estate men, the mortgage men, these 7 folks, they said, yeah, we wouldn't loan people money in those areas to build houses. We'll only be in these other areas. So it tells us what was already going on at the time, not that the federal government was evil or something like. I mean, maybe it was, but that's not the only thing this is telling us. So, okay. So to our study. So what we saw was there's these 2 neighborhoods adjacent to one another. The one just above it is usually called Cherrywood today, bounded by Manor Road, I-35, or East Avenue, and this is 38.5 Street. Now Airport Boulevard runs up here, but it didn't exist at the time. And then this was 19th Street, today MLK. And this neighborhood in here, this part is called Blackland. Some of this other parts of it are called Washington Rogers Holy Cross neighborhood, but we just shortened it to call it Blackland. But we acknowledge those different neighborhoods in there. But we wanted to compare these two for a couple of reasons. They're adjacent to one another, like I said. But what that means is that they're also in similar proximity to amenities around the city, which we know makes a big difference in value of real estate and homes. They were developing around the same time period. So you can see this was the 1935 map. Neither of these neighborhoods is fully developed, but they're partially developed. So they were developing at the same time. So we decided that they would be a good comparison near the right adjacent, just north and south of the color line in Austin. Similarly, in proximity to jobs, to amenities, things like that, and developing in the same-ish time period, right? It's pretty close. It's not a perfect match, of course, but relatively close. So what we wanted to do was look over time, how did the values of the land change over time? And we chose, again, just to focus on the land rather than the homes themselves, because, of course, homes are built at different times, they're different sizes, they're different quality of construction, different materials, and there's no good data, no complete data across large swaths of time to track all of that stuff. So we said, okay, we're just going to ignore the structures, the improvements on the land, and just focus on how much is 1 square foot of land on one side, one piece of dirt on one side of Maynard Road versus the other side of Maynard Road. So we went back again to the historical tax records. This time we decided to start in 1950 because it was significant, enough time after 1935 to start to see some differences. And we wanted to go to 1990, which I'll explain in a minute why we stopped there, and then pick a date in the middle, which would have been 1970. We were also trying to coordinate with the census years because that's where we initially started. Turns out 1970, 71, and 72 tax records are missing, gone, but we have 1973. So we have 1950, 73, and 1990 is what we looked at. And what we could see over time is if you add up the values of all of the land in those two areas over time, in 1950, the average square foot of land in that Cherrywood neighborhood was worth 7 cents. In Blackland, it was worth 6 cents, so a little bit less. If we're looking only at residential properties, which is what we ended up focusing on, partly because a number of the commercial properties, it was hard to figure out. A lot of the commercial properties were owned by white folks, even if they were on the south side of Maynard Road. And along East Avenue, so we wanted just to focus on residential. We can see the difference in value was 7 cents and 5 cents. By 1973, the gap had grown, and by 1990, it had grown even more, and these are the percentages. So the gap between the residential properties was, Blackland was 17.2% lower than Cherrywood, 27.1% lower in 73, and just about a little over half the value of the Cherrywood land in 1990. Now we decided to stop in 1990 because between 90 and 2000 was the time period that East Austin began to turn around in the sense of began to be gentrified, right? So we wanted to, today, a lot of parts of East Austin are more expensive per square foot than Cherrywood is today. So we wanted to figure out when did it make that turn, and it was between 1990 and 2000, and I'll show you some demographics, some statistics in a little bit on that. So we wanted to end in 1990. That was also in that time period before 2000 was when the city began to, created the ARA, Austin Redevelopment Association, sorry. I have the cover on here in a minute. And that began investing, bringing public money into Central to East Austin to make improvements to try to accelerate and aid the gentrification of East Austin. So here's just graphs that show the same data that we saw in table form a minute ago. And we can think about this gap here. Blackland is 53.6% lower than Cherrywood, or we could flip it around and say Cherrywood values are 46.3% higher than Blackland, or one way to think about that is that's the race tax that's imposed on the black land, literally black land, through redlining over time. We also created some of these fun 3D maps using ArcGIS, and you can see that as the property values grow, the blue ones are growing higher and faster than the pink ones. And there were still large or significant portions of this neighborhood that had yet to be developed by 1990, and some of it was publicly owned land, which we didn't include in our mapping. Okay, so then we're trying to say, okay, how can we turn this into some numbers? So if we added up all of the tax values of the land, the assessed value of the land in 1990 in black land, it came to a little over $5 million. If we take that number that we had identified on the last slide as the race tax and divide the 5 million by that, we get $10.9 million, which is the theoretical non-redlined value of that land. So absent the racial discrimination of redlining, what would that land be worth? We are assuming that it would be worth about what the land would be worth in Cherrywood, and therefore it would be worth about double what it was assessed at, which would be about $10.9 million. So what was suppressed by redlining is the difference between those two, which is $5.8 million. There were 534 residential lots in that blackland area that we looked at. So if we divide that total value by 534, we get close to $11,000 in value was suppressed per residential lot in blackland. Okay, so then we took that and we were trying to figure out how much overall was lost. Now, not every homeowner in blackland was in fact black. There were, plurality of black people living in that area, but not a majority. So we wanted to figure out how much value was lost to black folks who were homeowners in that area. So then we went back to the 1990 census. The tract that includes black land, the tracts don't correspond exactly to the neighborhood, but that was as close as we could get. Was 44.9% of the houses were owner occupied, all of the houses, white, black, Latino included. There were 558 black householders, so 44.9% of that would be 251, and then 251 by our $11,000 calculated above, we get about $2.7 million, the total value of the land in blackland that was lost in 1990. That's the value in 1990 dollars. So then we want to say, okay, what about the rest of East Austin? Because we were just looking at those two little neighborhoods, but what we were really interested in was how much value was lost in that whole part of East Austin that was redlined. So if we include those other tracts in there, which is all, here's the 4.02 tract that includes blackland. But then we wanted to know about the other parts of East Austin. In 1990, this is from the Census Bureau map from 1990, all the different census tracts. So if we go back to that and we look at all of these tracts, there were 10,429 residential properties overall. They represent a total land value of $74.9 million. Again, if we divide that by the race tax value, the non-theoretical, non-redline value is 161, yielding a loss of $86.6 million, or $8,303 per homeowner in the rest of East Austin outside of blackland. So we basically found that other parts of East Austin were less expensive, less valuable the land than in blackland, and so we wanted to make sure we capture that. So that's the calculations there, $8,000 per homeowner. Now, how many black homeowners were there? Again, we go back to the census. There were 6,000 black households. The owner occupancy rate was 42%, giving us around this many householders times the per household, and we get 21.5 million. And then we add up the 21.5 and the blackland values, and we get 24.2, which adjusts for inflation, about $57 million in 1990 was lost. Again, this last line is just to remind us it's land only, right? We're just talking about land. There's also housing. And of course, the houses deteriorated because there was no investment coming into those areas. It's a huge aspect of redlining, right? That the houses deteriorate, the built environment crumbles and makes living in those areas much more difficult. Also, can't resell, so it makes life very difficult. So that sets us up for thinking about the connection between redlining and gentrification that is pretty well established in the literature. But for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with that literature, geographer Neil Smith coined this phrase, the rent gap, to start thinking about how gentrification works from the perspective of investment into different areas. So what he talked about was, at a certain point, the gap between a neighborhood that was redlined, where the value was suppressed, and the gap of an adjacent neighborhood is a signal to investors that if you could change the character of this neighborhood, this is the potential value that you could realize by investing in that land. In other words, it represents a kind of potential amount of value that could be captured by redeveloping that part of the city, that land. So we could think about the gap as the gap grew larger and larger. It got to a point where developers were saying, and of course Austin is developing, more and more people are moving to Austin, and there's more developable area maybe is needed. At a certain point, or somewhere between 1990 and 2000, investors saw that if they could develop the neighborhoods, change the character of those neighborhoods, start to sell the land for higher and higher values, this is the potential that they might be able to get. And as I said before, some land in East Austin is now more expensive than Cherrywood, so they've kind of gone beyond that, right? They've leapfrogged over it. Here's some of the demographics. So here's from in our time span, 1950 to 1990. This is the total population of these census tracts that are the central part of East Austin. And it's a little bit complicated. Like I said, the census tracts don't correspond exactly. Part of Census Tract 4 goes a little bit north of Manor Road. And also, as time went on, there were more census tracts added further east. But these are 8, 9, and 4 are the kind of central part of East Austin. And if we look, there were in 1950, about 35,000 people living there. The population begins to decline down to 1990. And this is the population of white people and black people in these census tracts. And you can see that the black population was continuing to increase in numbers until 1970. And then in 1970, the black population began to decline, and the white population was precipitously declining at that time, so that the overall population declined. But somewhere between 1990 and 2000, the population began to go up. People began to move back into the neighborhood. Property values began to rise, and as I said before, the city and the ARA began this reinvestment of public money into the area. What's interesting or notable is that the black population continued to decline at this time period. So this, rebound, or sometimes it was called recovery, all kinds of words that were used, Renaissance, of course, and rediscovery, and all that kind of stuff that you see in the press, like in the Statesman covered this extensively at the time. It was all white people essentially coming back in. Here are kind of just some bar graphs, 1950 to 70 and 70 to 79 to show the black population increasing and then decreasing. And then here's the total time period, 1950 to 1990. White population declined by almost 70%, right, which is just kind of, or the total population, kind of unbelievable. This is the white population, unbelievable. The total population down by 38%, black population down by 45%. Meanwhile, Austin itself grew 252%, right? So as Austin was growing, this part of the city was really deteriorating, right? Because it had been redlined. So it was just there was, blocking of investment coming into the area, which meant that the conditions, especially of the built environment, were deteriorating over that time. And then we can see here, this period up to 2000 was when white folks started to move back in large numbers. Today, black people are only about 11% of these tracts in Austin. Okay, so this sets us up. Here's the ARA plan, master plan, as it came out in 1999 was when they finally published their plan. And the reason why they published it at this time and kind of were doing the formal study is because certain federal money became available at that time. It was about $8 million, which doesn't sound like very much by today's numbers when you think about all the billions that are being spent on the freeway. But it was significant for Austin at that time, which was, of course, a much smaller city at the time. But one of the prerequisites for accessing that federal money was to demonstrate that the area was blighted, right? That's the official term, blight, which is also super interesting to think about because blight is a horticultural term, right? It's about fungus and stuff on plants. So that began to be applied to cities in the 1930s, which is an interesting time period, kind of after the Chicago School of Urban Sociology was using lots and lots of ecological metaphors to talk about urban processes. Blight came to be used to talk about what was going on in cities, which, of course, on plants it spreads, right? And so that was part of the thinking, was that it spreads like a fungus. Anyway, so the ARA had to prove that the area was blighted, quote unquote blighted, and what they did was they did this extensive study of, this is Central East Austin, this is, oh my gosh, 11th Street here, 12th Street here, and this would be MLK, I think. And this is where the freeway is, and this is 7th Street, and this is where, this is the State Cemetery, and this is Houston till it's in here. And this is, Blackshear Elementary, I believe. And so what they did was they were able to, they showed that this was blighted, mostly because the houses, the physical attributes of the houses had deteriorated because of the redlining, right? So think about the whole thing. In 1928, they said black people must live here. Meanwhile, the financial and real estate men of Austin were not giving any money into that area. And then, because of those two things, it deteriorates. People leave the area because, by the time the Fair Housing Act was put in place in '68, black people could begin to move out to those areas that weren't accessible to them before that. And now the city, through the ARA, comes along, uses the blighting as a means to get this chunk of federal money to invest it in a lot of public, in a lot of buildings and infrastructure improvements in Central East Austin. This is all along 11th Street. And of course, this is probably all really familiar to you all. Historian Andrew Bush, who talked about he wrote a book called The Garden in the Machine about Austin, and a lot of it's about to the gentrification of East Austin. But he talked about how what he called the reclamation, symbolic reclamation of what was termed the East End at the time. It didn't catch on, obviously, but they tried to rebrand it, called it the East End, was really a signal to developers that this area was open for business. And if you track the actual development, the property values began to rise in that time period. The city began to invest in this after the ARA came out with their plan in 1999, so early 2000s, but the area was still struggling. And the ARA couldn't find tenants for most of the buildings that it had built, especially these two here, which they both have names, which I've forgotten the names of those buildings. But Oh, thank you. It wasn't until the city of Austin, the housing department, agreed to move into those buildings and become the primary tenant that other tenants started to come into that area. And that was really the big signal. That's when the floodgates really opened, that the city not only, helped to assist the, deterioration of this area, the out-migration, helped to enable the reinvestment into the area through the ARA, subsidize used the powers of eminent domain to take some of these properties, put up some of the money to build those buildings, and then was subsidizing the whole thing by being the primary tenant in those buildings. So it was really a city-led effort, in a sense, to bring back this area. And that was really when they started to see new tenants moving into the area, that the city said, look, they essentially propped up the rents in that area. They said, we're going to pay this level of rent. This is the level of rent people can begin to be getting in this area. And they showed that they're willing to do it. Other people started to be willing to do it. And therefore, because that was a level of rent that other people investors started to see was possible in that area. And that's what, of course, brings up the values of the property to that level of rent that is, bared by the market, essentially, at that time. So that's the end of the story. As far as we have had studied it up until, these two pieces of what the city asked the equity office to do, that we partnered with to take on these two aspects. So, any questions? Thanks.